Hey guys, tonight we drift down a cool stone corridor of history. An oil lamp crackles, a wooden door yawns open, and old portraits follow you with eyes that have slept for centuries. I'm speaking slowly, in the present tense, so you can see time settling like fine snow on your shoulders, hear a clock tick in a dark room, and feel a faint breeze in the curtains like the past taking a soft breath. This is an original narration, built on public sources and my own perspective. It does not quote copy scripts or reuse audio-visual material from any channel faithful to fair use, so you can relax and stay. If you're watching while nodding off, you won't survive this. The gentle drowsiness will take you before the prelude ends. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, what city are you in, and what's your local time right now? I love reading the night signals from everywhere. A fan's low hum, rain on tin, or simply a warm silence that can cradle a story. From Madrid to Vienna, from state letters to a quiet vow, we're not chasing shock tonight. We're placing an ear to an old wooden table and letting history whisper. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in the dark room, where the smell of candle wax blends with the scent of old wood, where the heavy curtain breathes very softly like an ancient living being. You are in Madrid, one night in 1834, and the order comes to you not with bugles or soldiers' footsteps thundering down the corridor, but with a small nod from a discreet official. The king has just passed away. There are no crowds and no acclamations. There is only you, a few close attendants keeping their mouths very shut, and a strange request as if stepping out of a note that should not exist. Preserve a relic tied to both the honour and the notoriety of the sovereign. You hear your heart knocking against your rib cage like a bird hitting glass. You inhale, see the flame on the candle wick sway slightly, as if the room itself were weighing how silent it ought to be. You do not ask again. You are familiar with the language of the court. The most important things are always spoken with the fewest words. You set the instrument bag on the table, the cold edges of medicine facing the hazy edges of power. The metallic sheen of forceps, scalpel and thread reflects your image, warped on the steel surface. You know you are touching not only matter, you are touching the thick mist of history, where the private of a body can weigh down an entire dynasty. You approach the silk-covered bed. The king's face is now peaceful in a ruthless way, as if all storms had receded, leaving only a level shoreline. You hear the small breath of an attendant standing behind you, the soft crack of his knuckles as he calms himself. No one mentions the rumours. No one dares to name what the people whisper about outside in the square. All call it merely a relic, as if changing the name could change the meaning. You touch the edge of the sheet with your gloved hands, feel the smooth weave like a warning. Here, every movement has invisible witnesses. You pause. Another inertia pulls you backward in time, like when you place your hand on an old book and the dust of letters breaks into frames. You see a boy growing up in the palace, where every step holds a resident whisper. You hear the muffled giggles of servants, the teasing lines in diplomats' letters, and you see the boy learning to walk without making an echo, learning to look down so as not to be looked into too deeply. You see that boy practice shallow breaths, hide embarrassment beneath ceremonial clothes, and every time the door closes, the shame swells like a shadow with nowhere to be tied. You do not excuse, nor do you condemn. You simply register a familiar mechanism. When fear is not called by its right name, it becomes a blade hidden in the sleeve. You pull yourself back to the present. This room not only keeps one person's secret, it also tests your skill. How to preserve the evidence of a dynasty without turning it into a new emblem of curiosity. You arrange the instrument tray out of habit. Forceps thread a vial of solution cotton tweezers. Everything is in its place like an orchestra ready to play the final piece. You feel your hands steady, your breathing more even. You understand that tonight's work is not about technique, but about attitude. How to keep dignity for a body when the stories about it have long lost dignity. You look around. The walls hang a few oil portraits, painted eyes following you with an irresistible, gentle sadness. You hear the wall clock strike each beat, and between two beats is a silence wide enough for you to tuck an entire lesson into it. Power, you think, is like a glove too tight. It protects the wearer from scratches, but it also numbs the sense of touch. When shame wears that glove, it becomes numb to itself and mistakes control for salvation. You see the chain reaction spread, from the private room to the corridor, from the corridor to deliberations, from deliberations to the affairs of state, where every decision carries the scent of anxiety. You slide the tray closer, the candlelight streaking a thin gold line along the steel edge. You remind yourself, do not tell this story as a curious oddity, tell it as a human mirror. You whisper, as if to a pupil in your imagination. Look here not at what people are curious about, but at how fear turns into mechanism. Listen here not to the whispers, but to the broken breaths of those who must live between ritual and silence. You feel yourself less taut, as when you switch from scalpel to needle. More careful, more gentle, you begin the procedure. The attendant's eyes flutter quickly, then hold still. You work as if writing a prayer by hand, slow, clean, without ostentation. You keep what is needed for the record, return to the room the scant dignity that remains. You are aware that, someday, someone will try to read here a sensational proof. But your role tonight is to close that door very softly, so that history can speak in a small voice. Learn to heal before you demand to rule. You step back, gloved fingers resting on the edge of the table. You feel the final stillness descend, not the heavy kind of silence, but the silence of a wound newly stitched shut. You fill in a few lines in the ledger, date, hour, names of witnesses, steps performed. Your handwriting is neat, like a small bridge laid over a black pond. You look up, meet the official's eyes in them. There is unspoken gratitude, and also an old fear not yet dissolved. You nod. You know your work ends here. The story, however, is only beginning. You blow out a candle to make the room less glaring, and the room answers with a velvet soft smell of smoke. You touch the doorknob, the cold piercing your glove like a reminder. Outside are long corridors, brick steps, and a city asleep. You will step out, telling listeners in the rhythm of the present what you saw tonight, the crampedness of a secret when a crown is thrown over it, and the spaciousness of compassion when we call fear by its right name. You know you will not hunt the unusual. You will follow the small paths leading from a closed room to the square of history, where every private story, if not healed, will cast a shadow over an entire era. You open the door. The corridor welcomes you with a cool current of air. Your footsteps sound very softly. You walk, carrying a quiet promise. Tell it slowly, tell it truthfully, and do not let curiosity overrun dignity. Madrid's night is still breathing, and you, the witness of tonight, are leading the listener into the next part of the journey. You take a slow breath, the smell of damp cloth and olive oil still on your fingertips. You stand up out of habit, the iron ring at your ankle clicking softly, as a reminder that every step has an audience. You dip the cloth into the basin, wipe away the stains left from the previous night. The water is cool, sliding over your skin and falling onto the stone floor as little drops that know how to count time. You are not in a hurry. You do each movement as if folding up a day, slowly, evenly, so that the knot in your stomach has a chance to loosen a little. The door opens, light tilting across your shoulder. You hear Demetrius read the rules like a song without high notes. Porridge in the morning, bread and olives at night, bathe when told, speak when asked, eyes lowered at the right angle, hands kept at the right distance. You nod, because here, understanding means silence. He signals you down to the lower rooms. The corridor is cold, the smell of damp lime and old wood braided together. You count 7 steps, then 3.5 paces to the turn, so that even with your eyes closed you can still find the way. In the room, Marcus sits against the wall, eyes hollowed but calm. Alexios is arranging the straw blanket, fistful by fistful, careful as if folding warmth itself. Philemon taps his fingertip lightly on the wall, 3 slow beats, too quick a habit to comfort himself. You greet them with a small nod. No one asks if you are all right, because the answer is already in the hand that trembles slightly. But everyone gives you a silence just long enough for you to arrange your breath again. You are taken to the washroom, where steam as thin as mist drifts. A servant hands you a thin tunic freshly laundered, the coarse fibers dry, like a very small promise. You change, tie the cords neatly, then look into the water in the basin, a face both familiar and strange, eyes that know how to keep quiet more. You no longer look for the you of yesterday in the water's mirror. You look for one small detail, a mole, a strand of matted hair to tell yourself you are still here in a very small way. Afternoon leans over the house. You practice what you need for the night. How to pour wine without letting the last drop fall. How to set a tray so the clink does not travel too far. How to step on the carpet as if stepping on water. You remind yourself to keep a slow rhythm. Inhale 4, exhale 6. Like that, your heart lowers its voice. You cannot change the wave, but you learn to drop your shoulders when it passes, so it does not take everything with it. Night comes, distant strings like drops of honey falling into warm water. You stand at the doorway of the parlour, eyes on the floor, ears reading the pitch low and high of the room. You pass the couches, set down the wine jar, fill the cups offered. You serve grapes, pieces of bread, damp cloths. Words pass through your head like winds, some cool, some dry, some carrying the reek of wine. You do not cling to any. You let them go. There is a gaze that lingers on you longer. You see it, but do not meet it. There is a courteous question about place. You answer just enough. The name of a region, the harvest season, the smell of smoke. You add nothing that would keep your memory awake tonight. You keep your story whole like a seed, alive, not yet sprouting. When laughter swells, you step back, letting the waves slide past. When voices soften, you step forward, set the cloth at the right moment. You are the rhythm, not the eye of the storm. While changing the wine jar, you see on the wall a mosaic telling the stories of gods, stones of blue, red, yellow fitted into a tranquil face. You think for a moment. People fit stones together to make a face, and you fit breaths together to keep a day. The thought passes. You stow the jar, continue the lesson of your hands. Everything is a procedure. But between procedures, you slip in a small pause, a blink half a beat longer, as if placing a pebble on the rail so the train slows just a little. Late at night, you return to the lower rooms. Warmth gathers in the stone, as if a fire has burned somewhere and left gentle ash behind. Marcus asks softly, "All right?" Not to hear the answer, but so you remember someone waits for your voice. You answer, "All right," not to brush it off, but to remind your body. You have made it through this night. Alexios hands you half a hard piece of bread, smiling crookedly. For tomorrow's breakfast to feel closer, you tuck the bread into your hem, like stowing a note to self. Tomorrow still arrives. You lie down, look at the stone ceiling. The breathing of the room folds into one, even, like small waves touching a pier. You raise your hand, imagine opening a window. Beyond it is the sky, not large, but with 2 stars bright enough for you to name. You name the first star Breath, because it stays when everything else leaves. The second star is Calling the Name, because whenever you call your own name in your head, you see a thin thread tying you to the one who once ran among the olive hills. You close your eyes. You quietly recount today like a slow-motion video. The basin, the fibre, the steps, the wine jar, the mosaic, the half piece of bread. You let each image pass without holding on. You do not need to forget. You only need to know how to set them down. At the end of the rewind, you whisper a short sentence. "I am still here." That sentence makes the small room more tranquil, and you sleep, not because of exhaustion, but because you have set your anchor in a harbour calm enough for tonight. Morning will come again. The sandals will strike again. The list will be read again. But right now you are breathing consciously, and that is enough to open a small space no one can touch. In that space, you sit next to yourself like a storyteller beside a listener, hand on shoulder, saying, "We have passed through another night." And you know, every night retold in a calm voice becomes a little lighter, as if the stone on your shoulders learns how to weigh less, little by little. You gently open the door of time and step into another chamber of courtly memory. You are in the second person, telling a story in a whisper meant for listeners seeking restful sleep. You are not in a hurry. You let each detail appear slowly like a breath. Before you is the lineage chart unrolled, the tangled lines between European houses, where consanguineous marriages once served to preserve territories and power. You do not turn that into judgment. You simply place it under a soft lamp, like setting an old map on a wooden table, so listeners can see the context before understanding the person. You speak softly that in that context, a child was born with silver cradle fittings and expectations heavy as armor. You see him grow up among lessons in ceremony, hours of riding, prayers, and studying foreign tongues. But in every marble corridor, you hear another sound. Whispers, half-hidden anecdotes, glances exchanged quickly, then averted. You do not repeat the rumors. You only describe the air. And in that air, the boy learns his first lesson about the world. Trust equals exposure. Exposure equals hurt. You pause a beat, so the listener can hear the fan turning in their bedroom, hear their heartbeats slow. Then you continue. His adolescence is not remembered for exploits or wise sayings, but for a bodily irregularity that embarrassed him. You do not need to describe it. You only tell the reaction. He contracts into himself, becomes vigilant, unsettled before every gaze. You walk a corridor with him, see a servant raise a hand to cover their mouth when speaking softly, see an envoy tilt his head slightly, and you know that in his eyes, every courtesy can be a needle. You say that the court, unintentionally, functions like a laboratory of the soul. Each gesture is a variable, each laugh a data point, and that youth learns to measure danger as a survival instinct. You narrate in the present, so listeners can feel the pressure of time. Breakfast, a lesson in etiquette and music, a riding practice. Amid it all, he avoids mirrors, avoids questions beginning with, why? You do not blame him. You simply place a hand on the imagined shoulder of a young person and speak softly. I hear your fear. You let the light change tone, from gold to deep blue. You describe an evening when the lanterns in the corridor cast shadows on the stone floor. He stands by a window, hears the chapel bell, and you hear his breath thin as a thread. In that moment, you understand why the temperament closes. When every glance can be an arrow, the only armor is control. You see the sprout of a habit of retaliation. Anyone who sees the private may be punished not out of malice, but out of fear of losing sovereignty over oneself. You remind the listener that this is not a lecture on genetics. This is a story about a person. You gently introduce an image. A young physician leaving a discreet note, a tutor trying to dispel rumors by focusing on Latin, an elderly lady in waiting whispering a prayer while drawing the curtain. All are trying to protect a youth from a swarm of rumor bees, yet the bees still find a path. You say slowly, private shame not called by its right name will become a distorted lens through which to view the whole world, and through that lens, kindness too can be suspected. You pour a little more gentleness into your voice. Imagine that boy learning to use power as armor. You see him tense up before banquets, recalibrate each sentence, track the reactions across the table like a math problem. You hear cutlery touch porcelain, the rustle of silk skirts, and you understand why his mind is tired. It must scan every detail to find danger. You say, you may not be in a palace, but you know that feeling, the feeling of interpreting every gaze as a verdict. And when that lasts, gentleness also turns closed. You guide the listener past the library. You run your hand along leather spines and say that here there were once answers he needed, but he was not calm enough to read. You tell of a music lesson abandoned halfway, a riding outing cut short. You tell of a lunch where every conversation is half finished. And then you speak of the seed of prejudice. When a small community lives too long in an atmosphere of whispers, fear becomes habit, habit becomes institution, institution then feeds prejudice. You lower your voice. That is how a lonely young man becomes a man always ready to defend. You invite the listener to breathe deeply. 4 counts in, 7 counts hold, 8 counts out. You leave it still for a moment, like placing a warm towel on the forehead of someone with a fever. Then you fit in the final piece. From the child in whispers, he steps nearer the throne with an implicit rule control, so as not to be seen. You do not excuse the authoritarian choices later on. You only point to the seed, a shame never called by its right name. You say, when we have no language for our wound, we will use command. When no one holds us with understanding, we will clutch power like a lifeline. You close this section with a soft image. Night falls, the brick courtyard still warm from the day. The youth sits alone, hearing footsteps recede. You stand beside him in imagination, place a warm cup of tea by him and say, "Tomorrow, try trusting one person, just one." Then you turn to the listener, smiling in your voice. You too, if there is something closed inside you, gently give it a name. You let the sound recede, so the listener's room holds only the fan's hush, and you promise. In the next part, you will walk with them a little farther from shame to power, from defensive reflex to the circle of retaliation, still in a gentle whispering rhythm, so anyone weary can close their eyes without fear. You stand at the threshold of another chamber of memory, where the yellow light spreads like honey across old wood. You narrate in the present, slow and gentle, so listeners can breathe deeply and their hearts settle. You say, when that man reaches adulthood, you see him train himself in a very human yet very dangerous reflex. Whenever anyone accidentally touches the forbidden zone, a consequence lands at once like a cold towel laid across the chest. A small mistake by a servant is enough to bring exile. An offhand joke is enough to silence an entire family. The message is carved into the stone wall. Don't look, don't know. You bring the scene closer. Inside the inner court, physicians sit together, voices lower than the rustle of paper fans, discussing medical interventions that they themselves are not sure can heal anything but worry. Each option is written in brown ink, folded, and stored in a drawer like a discreet plea sent to the future. Outside, rumours are like flocks of sparrows, alighting on balconies, picking up crumbs of information, then flying off as a noisy cloud. His name is pasted to mixed-up anecdotes, swelling the feeling of being besieged. You speak softly. That air teaches people to sniff out danger in every fragrance. You invite the listener to inhale very gently, hold a beat, then exhale long. You continue. You see a mental cycle operating on its own. From shame comes defense. From defense comes control. From control comes retaliation. And from retaliation comes isolation. Each turn has its own sound. A pen signing a transfer order quickly. A door lock snapping very softly. A sigh cut halfway. The more isolated he is, the more he relies on power to wrap himself like a silkworm cocoon. And the tighter the wrap, the thicker the cocoon, the less the light. You walk down the corridor with the listener. Doors are half closed, thick carpets mute footsteps, candles stand evenly like the ticks of a clock. A young aide steps by mistake into a room he should not enter, and you see a glance like a blade skim the air. There is no shout, no clamour, only a memo reassigning him to a distant post the next morning. You say, when power pairs with fear, it learns to act through silence. Silent yet effective. Silent yet making everyone self-adjust, like strings tightened another half-turn. You stop at the fork of two corridors. One leads to the study, where stacks of ledgers sit neatly, listing names to avoid and topics to refrain from. The other leads to the banquet hall, where ceremonial smiles hide quiet vigilance. You say, in both places, a habit is growing interpreting every signal as a threat. A compliment can be read as a test, a silence can be seen as a sign, and thus people abandon the language of sincerity to learn the language of insinuation. You lower the tempo of your voice, soft as a thin blanket laid across the shoulders. You say, gradually, the weight of a personal secret is transformed into a ruling style. Strictness in the court becomes the norm. Suspicion toward courtiers becomes an overactive immune system, reacting even to harmless dust. The belief that plots are everywhere becomes a pair of glasses that cannot be removed. You do not rush to condemn. You simply lay a hand on the fear and call it by its right name, so listeners see that what happens at the level of governance sometimes begins with a very small spasm in a person's chest. You stride through the inner courtyard, where the breeze carries the scent of ripe oranges. You tell, not the battles on the frontier, but the discreet rituals in the palace quietly shape the dynasty's future. The guard rotation schedule thickens, secret passageways multiply, memorials are required to take detours, through more eyes, with more seals. Everything is meant to ensure that no one can see too deeply into the center. But just then, you see the seed of loneliness take root. At the center, no one dares to speak truth in a normal voice. You invite the listener to place a hand on the chest, to feel the heartbeat slowing. You say, when power is used to smother sound, it also smothers the whisper of conscience. A young person with a good idea learns to keep quiet for safety. An elder with experience chooses to speak in circles to be proper. And the king, amid those filters, hears only what he already thought. You exhale, slow and deep. That is when an unhealed inner loop begins to steer the whole machinery of the court. You introduce an image, a handwritten list, tucked in a drawer, cataloguing those who once saw what should not be seen. No one is condemned before the public, but their career paths drift slow like boats run aground. Some ask to return to the countryside, some shift to work with fewer collisions. The entire palace learns the same lesson. Safety lies in not knowing too much. You speak softly. That is how a court blinds itself, simply because it fears light exposing a soul's scratch. You hear distant bells and warm your voice like pouring hot tea. You remind that there is still a quiet hope. If someone gentle enough can name the shame, and steady enough not to flee before the reflex of retaliation, the loop can stop. But in this story, before that happens, another door opens the door of marriage. You stand before that threshold with the listener, where the expectation of succession meets the fragile reality of body and spirit, where a splendid wedding must face questions that ritual cannot answer. You close this section with a long breath, not out of sadness, but to reset the heartbeat. You ask the listener to dim the lights one notch more, so the room grows calm like a lake surface. Then you smile within your voice. You will go on, still with soft steps, to see which deep layers a wedding touches, to see whether power can learn the language of healing, or will put on yet another layer of armor. And now, you ask only a very small thing. Keep the breath even, so the next story can come to you like thin wind through a curtain. You step into another corridor of the story, where the yellow lamplight pours down like honey, and the fan hums softly behind you. You narrate in the present, slow and gentle, so listeners can place a hand on their chest and feel their heartbeat settling. Here, the court mobilizes everything. Physicians with leather, wrapped instrument bags, craftsmen with calipers and tracing paper, and those who call themselves versed in quasi-scientific methods, slipping through the side gate in dark cloaks. They come for a single goal, to repair the irregularity so the line of succession will not break. You do not judge. You simply set the oil lamp closer, so listeners can see clearly how an urgency can pull the whole apparatus off course. You stand beside a long table covered with a white cloth, where medical notes lie stacked like silver fish under moonlight. Ink pens describe technical difficulties, list risks, and emphasize two words: caution and support. You read between the lines. Respect the body, listen to the boundaries of the mind, go slowly. But you also hear the hurried footsteps of politics. Time is on no one's side. The pressure of succession pounds on the door like a storm. When medicine cannot promise what power wants to hear, the gap is filled at once with baseless tonics, amulets tucked under pillows, and easy guarantees as if belief alone were enough. You turn into the craftsman's workshop. The smell of cedar, new leather, and the fine saw blade biting into an edge of wood create a steady background music. On the table, pencil sketches mark cautious curves, measurements taken to support posture and reduce harm. You name them properly. Lifting devices, cushions, brace frames, not for prying curiosity, but to see the pure effort of humans before a hard problem. Artisans speak in metaphor, physicians speak in clinical language. Both, strangely, are seeking the same thing: how to keep intimacy from becoming a test of endurance. You return to the main corridor, where people carrying glass vials and whispered promises glide by like shadows. They speak of pearl powder, of herbs from distant regions, of the lunar calendar and sacred nights. In that you hear the breath of powerlessness turning into magic. When science stops, illusion steps forward. You speak softly to the listener. This is a double tragedy. The body needs scientific care, and the court needs clear laws. yet both are being led by a single craving. There must be an heir, at any cost, and that any cost begins to wear down trust and blur ethical boundaries. You bring an imaginary camera into the marriage chamber, keeping the lens distant and the light soft. The marriage bed is no longer a place of rest. It is converted into a workbench, where cushions are placed by diagram, where the hourglass is flipped to keep time, where medical instructions wedge themselves into the space between a hand clasp. You do not describe bodies. You describe the air, the rustle of paper, the light tap of a pen, the broken rhythm of breath from tension. You hear tenderness, which should have led the way, retreating to the back like a secondary character who has run out of lines. You open another ledger, the expense book. Funds for banquets are trimmed to add to instruments, to specialists, to the private security layer of the sealed quarters. Outside, embassies wait for dispatches. Inside, every appointment is shaped by the cycle of examinations. You say, a healthy polity needs clear law to solve the succession puzzle, rather than piling all expectation on a body already weary. When law is not transparent enough, people exhaust their minds on technical solutions for a moral issue. When trust breaks, devices are given authority in place of understanding. You invite the listener to breathe in 4 counts, hold 7 counts, exhale 8 counts. You let their room rest for a few seconds, then continue. In the physician's notes, you see reminders about psychological trauma, about the need for comfort and time. In the artisan's designs, you see efforts to make everything less painful. But at the council table, you hear another drumbeat. Fast, must be fast. Do not let rumour outrun us. That very tempo makes prudence look like delay, turns delicate consensus into a signature pressed under pressure. You pass a half-open window, the breeze carrying in the scent of medical oils, candle wax, and a faint hint of orange blossom. You say, when intimacy is managed like procedure, the heart will find a way to withdraw. One person learns to leave the room with their gaze while the body is still there. Another learns to say, I'm fine, in an even tone though the throat is dry. Devices born to protect boundaries and reduce harm now become emblems of a court obsessed with control, a control that believes reality can be molded to fit commands. You lower your voice, as if draping a thin cloth over the story. You say, there are nights when physicians advise stopping, artisans say adjustments are needed, but the court schedule says, no more time. Those no more times add up into a long scratch across trust. And when trust fractures, people rely on tools more than on people, rely on procedure more than on the whisper, are you okay? You do not blame anyone, you only point gently at the mechanism. The urgency of must have an heir turns everyone into screws in a machine, forgetting that some things can grow only in patience and kindness. You end this segment with a slow frame. The craftsman's footsteps recede to the workshop, the scent of oils fades, the physician's hard-backed pages close. In that quiet, you let the listener feel for themselves. When the need for succession is lashed to an anxious body, the court easily slips into misguided choices instead of healing and respect. They choose to force reality into obedience to orders. You murmur a reminder, do not let this story be only of the past. Then you invite the listener to sip some water, adjust the pillow, and get ready to go on to the place where marriage meets trauma, where patience and compassion still have a chance to turn what seems impossible. You stand on the stone steps, where tonight the lantern light shimmers like stars falling onto silk cloaks. You narrate in the present, slow and gentle, so listeners can breathe deeply. A young princess is entering the great gate, carrying romantic imaginings like ribbons wrapped around her wrist. You hear the soft brass of trumpets, the long peal of the chapel bells, and the scent of orange blossoms covering the entrance. The wedding is splendid, each step a new page, each smile a seal of rejoicing. But even within the applause, you already feel an invisible taut thread. The expectation of succession is pulling the whole palace along a very narrow path. You follow her through the long corridor, where old portraits look down with eyes that have witnessed many weddings before. You let the imaginary lens rest on the banquet table. Silver goblets gleaming, polite toasts, refrains about perfect happiness. But behind the closed door, you hear the rustle of papers, the whisper of physicians, the soft footsteps of craftsmen moving very lightly, the The wedding night, according to romantic legend, should have only candles, music, and tender whispers. Yet here, you see a small diagram laid beside the bed, a few medical instruments wrapped in white cloth, and instructions cold as notes in an operating room. You do not describe bodies, you describe the air. It thickens like fog between one who has just worn the crown of a husband and one who has just worn the crown of power. You hear her heartbeat stumble into the emptiness of worry. You see her hands tremble slightly as a lady in waiting draws the curtains closer. Romance breaks not with noise, but with a dry swallow, with a question, "Are you okay?" that no one truly answers. You, the narrator, speak softly to the listener. Inhale 4 counts, hold 7 counts, exhale 8 counts. You want this room to ease, even if only by a breath. The psychological shock arrives like a strange wind tipping the candle flame. She panics, not because of the dark, but because of the feeling of being placed on the scales of a plan drawn up before she arrived. You see the physician recommend rest. See an attendant brew a warm medicinal tea. Light doses of medicine become the float for her to swim across a duty her heart cannot yet reach. You hear doors open and close, footsteps coming and going, and a tempering whisper, "Tomorrow will be easier." But tomorrow, in the palace, is often a quiet copy of today. You shift the scene very slowly. The succession schedule turns into squares on a wooden board, where each night is marked, each attempt is annotated. The effort to have a child meant to be the fruit of closeness now becomes a repeated ritual, mechanical and estranged. You hear the hourglass flipped, hear a pen dip in ink to mark the time. Each failure draws another grey layer down across the ceiling. Sometimes faith tries to sprout, but a cautious hand covers it with sand. Suspicion grows like a crack running the length of the wall. No one wants to touch it, and no one dares to name it. Before the public, they are still a royal couple. You walk with them through the great hall, see radiant robes, see smiles perfectly proper, see the joyful eyes of the people. But in the inner quarters, you see only 2 exhausted human beings. One haunted by a shame that has turned into a habit of control. One sinking into a fog of fear so deep she can no longer distinguish the knock of a loved one from the knock of anxiety. Their room becomes a silent cage, beautiful, intricate, but short of air. You open a physician's note. Rest, comfort, reduce stimuli, pause. You open a court memorandum. Continue, for the nation needs an heir. 2 voices, 2 drumbeats, collide upon the same table. And in between, a woman's heart is like a string tightened another turn each day. You narrate without judgment. When the law of succession is not clear enough, people place the future upon a weary body. When compassion is not strong enough, procedure takes the place of tenderness. Then come the delicate days. A small good news buds like an out-of-season flower. The court holds its breath. You see curtains drawn more gently, hear footsteps in the corridor slow down. But the days pass as upon glass, and delicacy cannot bear the tremors of pressure. A miscarriage passes like a night rain. No one speaks loudly. Only wet streaks remain on stone. She grows thinner. Dark circles deepen from nights where sleep does not dare lay its head. You speak softly to the listener. Place your hand on your chest. Give your heart an apology on behalf of someone who did not manage to apologize to herself. Malicious rumors bloom outside the palace gates like wild sunflowers after rain. Some whisper of charms, some blame temperament, some accuse her of failing to fulfill duty. Invisible arrows strike one already fragile. You see her write unsent letters, one to her mother, one to herself in the future. In them, she speaks of shapeless fear, of the feeling of being measured in every gesture, of a simple wish for a hand to hold a hand. You place these letters into an imaginary drawer, so the listener knows that sometimes what we need is simply to be seen as a person. In the long silence, the husband learns more ways to control. Rituals thicken, the list of taboos grows longer. He thinks he is protecting. In truth, he is raising more walls. You see doors shut more tightly, meetings shortened, inquiries turned into procedure. And each procedure draws a little more oxygen from a room already short of air. You hear her breathing, short and even, as if telling her heart not to beat too hard. lest it break what is cracking. You do not go into sensitive details. You let the story stand at the threshold of psychology, where everything can be understood in the language of care. You say, when intimacy is replaced by procedure and pressure, marriage becomes a silent cage. In that cage, the most important sound is the whisper, "I am here," or "I am here." Yet that sound is the rarest of all. She leans on light medicines like a small stair to pass the days, and he leans on orders like a fence to feel less afraid. They pass by each other many times within the same room, and still feel a distance that cannot be named. You end this telling with a very slow frame, the windows slightly open, near dawn, faint pink streaks thinning across the tiles. She sits on a chair, hands wrapped in a thin scarf, watching the sun rise like a reminder that a new day arrives, though hearts are not ready. You stand behind her, in imagination, set down a warm cup of tea, and say softly, "You have done your best." Then you turn to the listener, inviting them to breathe with you. Inhale slowly, hold still, exhale long. You want them to understand that tragedy does not come from the strange thing of rumor. It comes from the absence of compassion, from the lack of true mental support in a politicized marriage. And you promise, in the next part, you will go even more gently to see whether a sprout of healing can break through the pebbled ground of ritual, because even in a palace, hope has a habit of growing where people least expect it. You open your eyes in a quiet evening, hear the fan running steadily like a distant counting beat, and you narrate in the present, slow and gentle, so the listener has time to place a hand on the chest. After the splendid wedding days, you see their married life drift into a schedule so regular it turns cold. Each attempt is prepared like a surgical procedure. Physicians come and go on soft steps. The scent of herbal alcohol clings to the curtain edge. Discreet notes are pinned with a brass clip at the head of the bed. Ladies in waiting whisper to one another about the procedures to be followed, as if memorizing an unnamed ritual. You listen, and amid an air thick with rules, the young wife's heart draws in like a door half closed, no longer wishing to open to anyone. You follow her through endless afternoons. She sips a warm tea, then a pill small as a raindrop. She soothes herself with the ticking rhythm of the wall clock, hoping sleep arrives before the dry knock of the schedule. You hear the soft turn of paper, the scratch of pen on hardback, and you understand that here, intimacy has been molded into a form. The feeling of belonging to each other is replaced by the feeling of having to complete. Tender whispers are replaced by instructions. The more they chase proper procedure, the more the room loses the softest thing it once had, compassion. With the king, you see each failure pour into a new pressure. He tightens the timetable like adding another knot to a rope, hoping to hold what is slipping away. When science gives no answer, half-real, half-fabled methods suddenly rise. You meet strangers stepping through the side gate at dusk, one carrying a charm embroidered with gold thread, one carrying a quarter-folded lunar calendar, one calling himself a sage of old lines of knowledge. They speak of auspicious days, good hours, of arranging objects for favourable breath, of prayers that only need repeating the right number of times. You do not judge, you simply tell in a gentle voice. Sometimes people mark the feeling of powerlessness with a new belief. Hope at times flickers like a small flame in the palm. You see a faint smile on someone's lips, see the curtains open a sliver wider. Then the flame goes out. An imperfect result is written into the ledger like a fine scratch. The emptiness after each time grows wider, and in that emptiness suspicion sprouts. He blames lack of cooperation, as if the heart too must obey orders, and she blames herself, as if bearing an invisible curse no one can explain. You hear two sighs that cannot meet each other in the middle of the room. You lead the listener along a silent corridor where candles line up straight like little exclamation points. Each faces pain in their own way. One controls, building more walls, adding to the list of taboos. One avoids, learning to be absent in her own body, passing days with her gaze vacated from its dwelling. You touch the wood of the door, feel the cold seep into your fingertips, and understand that both are exhausted beneath the shadow of a single desire, to have an heir. As that desire swells, other things are pushed back. Gentleness, the ability to converse, the intention to listen. Everything is measured by capability instead of feeling. You look down at the blue-tiled floor, where the royal physician's shoes tap an even beat. Each tap is a thin ribbon wrapping around the heart, tighter and tighter. The soft turn of paper is like a weary bird's wing. The broken sigh is like a wave lapping weakly against the night shore. All meld into a steady, sorrowful music, signalling a marriage cracking from within. You speak quietly, as if lulling the listener. Private shame, if not named and embraced, will find a roundabout way to appear. It will become ritual, regulation, red seals marching down a memorial. You open a pane of imagined window to look into their room. She sits by the table, hand resting on the edge of the cloth as if holding some hem of herself. On the wall, a still life of a pear-blossom vase in ash grey. The oil lamp breathes quietly. He stands near the window, looking through the frosted glass, as if seeking a guiding line somewhere in the sky. Between them is a distance measured not in meters, but in sentences never spoken. You do not intrude. You only set an imagined warm glass of water on the table and ask the listener to breathe in the 4-7-8 rhythm so the room will tremble less. Then you see the procedure thicken. More tables, more note columns. Each attempt has its own code, as if a new label could produce a new result. Doors crisscross with locks, side passages are opened, then closed again. Young servants learn to walk very lightly. The old clerk learns to write without a single erasure. Everyone strives to be correct. Yet in that striving, the most correct thing, caring for each other, is not recorded in any column. You smile sadly. When intimacy turns into procedure, compassion will be the first to find its way out of the room. You invite the listener to place a hand on the neck, feel the warmth of the skin, to remember that the body is a home needing reassurance more than orders. You go on. There are nights when the physician advises stopping, nights when the craftsman asks to adjust a few details, but the court schedule says, no more time. Those no more times pile up like roof tiles, pressing down upon the most fragile spot. You hear night rain somewhere, soft and steady, like a reminder that some rhythms should come only when we are ready. In the end, you pull the frame back to see the whole palace like a large body. Invisible cracks run along corridors, slip behind curtains, seep into armchairs. At the centre, the heart of the court beats by schedules and seals, more than by feeling. You say, this is not a story about someone's oddity, but a story of how a system can ossify when it forgets the human. By the end of the section, you do not dwell on bodily details. You place a hand upon mental fatigue, a hand warm enough for anyone listening to feel comforted. You pause a beat, letting the fan return to background sound. Then you softly promise, in the next part, you will still go slow, go gently, to see whether an honest word can cross the wall of ritual, to see whether a sentence like, I am here, can piece together the shards that the schedule has inadvertently let fall. You stand on the threshold of a grey morning, where the chapel bell strikes slow, beats upon roof tiles damp with mist. You narrate in the present, slow and gentle, so the listener can place a hand on the chest and breathe in deeply. When the first wife fades away in a sequence of weary days, the court holds a solemn yet melancholy funeral. Black ribbons drape along the corridors, candles burn low, the scent of resin mingles with white chrysanthemum. The palace is heavy with unspoken questions. What was left unsaid? What was strangled into silence amid the rites? You walk beside the slow procession, hear cloaks brush softly against stone, hear breaths trying to hide themselves. You pause in the inner courtyard, where the shadow of the orange tree casts on the paving as if a long prayer. Rumours spread faster than wind. Some whisper of conspiracy, others mention the invisible hand of fate. Each whisper is a small blade, not cutting deep, but cutting long. You neither confirm nor deny. You only register the feeling of being besieged, like a layer of fog soaking through clothes to chill the bones. The king keeps a ceremonially proper grief, eyes rimmed with dark, posture composed, replies concise. But you know public business cannot stop. The nation still needs a queen, and signing hands return to the documents. Envoys begin once more to send letters of inquiry. You breathe in slowly. Invite the listener to hold the breath for 5 counts, then exhale long. This wedding is simplified on the surface. Fewer fireworks, less celebratory wine, fewer songs. But inside, you soon recognize the old cycle: striving, preparing, and fear. The new queen enters the palace carrying instructions both intricate and fussy, things to know, written into a quarter-folded table of contents. You follow her through cool corridors, hear shoes touch stone, and feel the air of a treatment room more than a bridal chamber. Detailed schedules, method notes, recommendations for rest, everything as if borrowing medical language to speak about what ought to need only the language of the heart. You do not go into detail, you simply place a hand on the surface of the air. Psychological trauma arrives silently. She starts at sudden knocks on the door, dodges the gaze of her own husband, as if avoiding a beam too harsh, and often wakes in the night with nameless panic attacks. You hear her counting breaths in the dark. 4 counts in, 7 counts hold, 8 counts exhale. Each cycle a fragile bridge carrying her across the wobble. Beside her, the king, impatient for succession, allows foreign experts to observe, advise, even write reports. The atmosphere of the royal court gradually resembles a laboratory. Procedures, forms, remarks, feedback. And a woman's heart turns into a crystal vase, always at the edge of breaking, needing only the smallest jolt to crack wide. You lead the listener through the study, where pages stamped with red seals stack into columns. Summary, recommendation, note. Each item dances like letters that want to replace the human. You hear in the clerk's slow reading a fear of error more than understanding. Outside, the orange grove is still fragrant. Inside, the room lacks the scent of compassion. You say softly, "Some wounds are not in the body, but in the place where we are viewed as a task." Then, phantom pregnancies appear like lightning on the horizon. The court flares with hope. Curtains open wider. Footsteps grow lighter as if afraid to break something delicate. But that hope often dies like a lamp before the wind, leaving a queen faded eyes deeper, shoulders thinner, and a king more suspicious. You hear closed-door discussions running longer than usual, hear questions circling around, hear a single why that is never spoken straight. And between courteous punctuation marks, the distance widens like a bottomless crack. You stop at a high window, look at the cement-coloured sky of a sombre afternoon. You see the king standing with his back turned, hand on the chair rail, as if trying to clutch some order amid the chaos of feeling. You see the queen sitting upright, hands intertwined, as if holding a thin glass that must not fall. They speak to each other in the language of rules, more than the language of the heart. And each time a rule is added, a piece of tenderness is subtracted. You wish to set upon the table between them the word reassurance. But that word, at this moment, is like a rare bird that dares not alight on any shoulder. You go on with a slow tempo. Malicious rumours outside the palace gates bloom again. People discuss curses, omens, signs from the sky. You hear the heavy iron gate close, as if to shut out the world's noise. But the world's noise has slipped in another way through papers, through letters, through glances. Each new rumour is like a pebble thrown into a pond, ripples spreading outward, striking the shore again with unpredictable streaks of water. And at the centre of that circle is a tired heart that only wants to believe tomorrow can be peaceful. Then death visits again, this time light and cold, like the hand of night. Morning once more covers the stone corridors. Flags at half-mast, low candles, and prayers even as falling rain. Only this time, the emptiness is deeper. It gnaws even at language, leaving people only whispering, afraid of accidentally dropping some fragment of the dynasty. You pass the funeral chamber, see wreaths of white-like circles of time repeating, stacked to the point of overwhelm. You hear someone's footsteps change direction halfway, as if every path leads to an invisible wall. You invite the listener to place a hand on the neck, to feel the warmth of life. You say, "Here, tragedy lies not only in oddities, as rumours say, but in the absence of compassion and proper mental support." When a marriage is politicised, people easily forget that some questions can only be answered by presence. "I am here. I hear you. I am not in a hurry." You let the listener's room settle for a few breaths, then gently instruct. Breathe in 4 counts, hold 7 counts, exhale 8 counts, so sorrow has a passage through without turning to stone in the chest. At the end of the section, you step back, to see the entire palace like a great instrument. Strings too tight choke the resonance. Strings too slack scatter the notes. Now, the music is a thin line, trembling, trying to continue. You look into the darkness between 2 candles, and believe that there is still a silent sprout there that could bloom into peace, if someone gentle enough would name it. You promise to go on, light as footsteps on stone corridors, to see whether at the crossing of mourning and hope, people can find a new language for tenderness, a language no report can write in their stead. You stand in the gentle light of a late afternoon, hearing the fan run steadily like wind blowing through an orange grove hidden behind a wall. You narrate in the present, slow and soft, so the listener can place a hand on the chest, feel the heartbeat settle. For the 3rd time, the court seeks a princess better prepared. She has her own physician, a notebook of meticulous entries, recommendations bound into volumes like a user manual for the discreet life inside the palace. She steps through the gate with the bearing of a scientist, keeping just enough distance so her heart will not shatter, keeping order for things that may sway. You see her open the notebook, rule lines, record date and hour, render feelings, describe reactions, everything is named, as if naming alone would make it less hazy. You walk beside her through the cool stone corridor, hear the pencil glide softly across paper. Each appointment is recorded to the minute, prepared like an experiment to be repeated. Her physician speaks in short, unshowy sentences. The notes use neutral language, avoiding all judgment. That calmness, instead of soothing, makes the king more uneasy. You see a faint ripple in his eyes. The feeling of being observed, turned into a case study, fitted into the frame of a report. From there, suspicion creeps into small things. Outgoing letters are vetted more carefully. Private conversations are remembered by special signs. Even a knock at the door startles someone. You do not judge. You simply lay a hand on the air and whisper, "Here." Everyone is trying to protect the fragile part of themselves. Meanwhile, outside the palace wall, the country bears other wounds. The treasury runs dry like a well, long without rain. Regions grow restless. Missions from afar bring news flickering like smouldering sparks. One place demands more rights, another lacks provisions, yet another whispers about a separate future. You hear officials' shoes hurry along the corridor, but the meeting is postponed for a medical appointment, for a bout of the king's pessimism, for one more consultation to be more certain. That very delay lets opportunity slip like sand through fingers. A memorial arrives one day late. A fleet leaves port 1 week late. A guarantee comes after hearts have cooled. Small delays add up to a large crack. You pause by a half-open window, the scent of medical oils blending with candle wax and the faint smell of distant rain. In the room, the princess, now queen, writes on patiently. She records even the hard-to-name things. Today the heart is a little lighter. Last night it was hard to sleep. The bell calmed me down. The precision of language brings a fragile kind of reassurance, while the king, looking at those neat lines, feels himself viewed under a magnifying glass. He avoids silences, fills them with instructions, with procedures. You know that when fear wears the clothes of power, it often speaks in very reasonable tones. Then one day, hope buds. A delicate report like a silver thread sewn into the morning. Pregnant. The whole palace holds its breath. The schedule is loosened. The curtains fall softer. Footsteps naturally lighten. The king prays. He invites physicians of traditional law, invites even those who speak in ancient language, masters of auspicious days and months. The doctor advises rest. Midwives recommend taboos. Servants change the herbal tea. You hear somewhere a small melody, like a hazy lullaby of hope. The lines in the Queen's notebook then grow simpler. Slept, ate, heart steady. But fate, once more, does not choose to stay. The child is born earlier than expected, like a star falling in haste across the sky, then quietly goes out. No one speaks loudly. Only hands clasp each other tighter. Curtains draw more closed. Prayers are spoken lower. The queen weakens after a fierce illness, her body like a thin wing rubbed too long by wind. You stand at a pane of imagined window, set a warm glass of water on the table, wanting to say, "Rest." But the court schedule still opens and shuts. Shoes still tap evenly on the tiles, and a deeper weariness spreads like ink bleeding in water. After the funeral, the king sinks into denial. He clings to impossible methods, requests, trials the doctors refuse. He rejects the boundary of life and death as he rejects his own failure. You see him stay up too late, stand before candles shortened low, lips murmuring commands like incantations of the times. When he realizes cannot, the palace has already soaked up the scent of spent wax and faded flowers. The white chrysanthemums, fragrant yesterday, today, exhale the fatigue of a day gone long. You hear the old clock strike slowly, and between two beats is a gap wide enough to hide a sob. Outside, the country still asks for a steady hand. But that hand, now, trembles with a private sorrow that has nowhere to rest. Important decisions are postponed. Reform plans halt at "will discuss further." Letters awaiting signatures lie still beneath a paperweight shaped like a lion. You lead the listener through a cold council room, long benches empty, the great map on the wall dimming for lack of eyes. You say softly, "When private pain has not been named, the nation must learn to wait." You invite the listener to breathe in 4 counts, hold 7 counts, exhale 8 counts. You want the listener's heart to soften, to leave space for a gentler thought. Cold notes can help keep us from losing our way, but cannot replace care. Procedure can protect the rhythm, but cannot replace presence. The queen has tried to endure in her way in the language of data. The king has tried to endure in his way in the language of control. Between those two forms of endurance, the most fragile thing, compassion, is the one most often forgotten. You close the telling with a slow frame. The window ajar, dusk in the sky, a flock of birds passes over the roof tiles like a semicolon to the day. On the table, the queen's notebook stops at a half-written page. Tired today, but still hopeful. The pen lies across, the ink not yet fully dry. At the head of the corridor, the king stands alone, hand on the cold stone wall, inhaling as if to hold something that is leaving. You stand beside him. In imagination, whisper to the listener, "Name your sorrow, then set it down." Because you understand, and the listener is also understanding, that each time power bends to heal a heart, the country frays a little less. In the next part, you will still go slow, go gentle, to see whether beneath this layer of ash there is still a smouldering ember enough to warm the living and light the way for the decisions needed tomorrow. You stand in a pale afternoon, hearing the fan run steadily like the palace's long breath. You narrate in the present, slow and gentle, so the listener can let their shoulders drop. The court arranges a 4th marriage with a clever and practical princess. Everyone expects a smoother beginning, a safe turning for the throne. This time, instructions are shortened, noisy rituals pared back, as if simplicity could lighten the heart. You hear shoes moving more softly, doors opening and closing with care, and you sense a cautious hope stepping into the corridor. Then a very small dawn arrives. A little princess is born, carrying a smile thin as the outline of early morning after a string of long nights. You see the curtains open another sliver of light, hear the nanny's soft lullaby blending with the gentler heartbeat of those standing near. In that moment the palace seems to soften, the old stones seem warmer. But the dynasty's dawn has not yet had time to shine before a familiar darkness creeps onto the wall, the shadow of suspicion. The king, haunted by earlier collapses, reinforces everything. You see secret passages swept clean, food tasters changing shifts constantly, surprise inspections appearing like drafts of wind. Papers are sorted, letters sealed, then opened again in silence. He seeks certainty by looking through small holes in the wall, peepholes slipping between 2 rooms, between 2 lives. Yet the more he looks, the more he sees only the reflection of doubt. Every glance could be a signal, every silence could be a ploy. The queen learns to live in a glass cage. You see her measure every step, weigh every word, adjust even her expression so it will not be misread. She practices smiling like a door opened a crack, not too wide to let in a draught, not too closed to be considered cold. Each morning, she chooses words as one chooses thin porcelain. Lift lightly, set lightly, so nothing breaks. You do not judge. You only place a hand upon the surface of the air and notice a slight breath-changing rhythm each time someone passes the doorway. The servants are weary from both caring and reporting. You hear the scratch of pen on thick paper, a cut-off sigh, a spoon tapping the rim of a bowl like a mandatory count. They are gradually exhausted by the invisible art of proper procedure, cleaning so it leaves no trace, listening without seeming to listen, recording without showing a line of judgment. Sometimes, just a small mistake, a tea tray arriving late, a window left open too long is enough to trigger a quiet inspection, like shadows gliding along the wall. Outside the palace wall, envoys of other nations write of an unstable court. You read in those reports the scent of cold mist. Fragile agreements slow down, negotiations are postponed, promises must wait for final confirmation. The treasury, already thin, must bear the invisible costs of a control machine always hungry for resources. More guards, more eyes and ears, more seals. Every coin spent on fear is a coin taken from bread, from roads, from a bridge that needs repair. And inside the palace, the longest nights are the quiet ones. Quiet enough that people hear their hearts beating fast with fear, hear candle wax run in tiny lines, hear a breath catch and continue. You invite the listener to inhale 4 counts, hold 7 counts, exhale 8 counts like laying a warm cloth on the forehead. A child laughs, and a father's joy is both bright and bittersweet. The future of the dynasty, therefore, is both bright and fragile. A babbling sound softens the whole room, but then the shadow of eyes on the wall lengthens again. You see the king stack reports into neat piles, his gaze skimming lines as if seeking a formula. How to be certain? The old question repeats like the ticking of a clock. There is no answer except another layer of guardianship, another command to keep silent, another door to inspect. You understand, when fear puts on the clothes of reason, it persuades with complete tables and procedures that sound very right. But each new fence erected takes away a small piece of trust, like wind whittling the edges of leaves. The queen, in that glass cage, learns to nurture very small pockets of peace. She stands by the window at early morning, letting sunlight glide across the back of her hand like a greeting. She writes a few lines for the day. Today, smile with the child. Afternoon, listen to the bell. Evening, be quiet. Those simple notes are like a grain of salt in a too bland soup, not enough to change everything, but enough to remind that flavor remains. You stand beside her, imagining setting a warm cup of tea on the table, so the scent of herbs threads through the glass, quietly settling on the eyelids. You pull the frame back outside the gate, look at the map of the country hanging in the study. Borders tremble under candlelight, as if to remind that everything is moving though the palace wants to stand still. A delegation of envoys awaits replies. A team of bridge workers awaits funds. A frontier region awaits reinforcements. You speak softly to the listener. There are times when the only certainty is choosing between more locks and more trust. And here, people still choose locks. At the end of the section, you let the room's light fall, let the fan return to background sound. You say, "The dawn has come, but the shadow of suspicion remains. The wall grows higher, yet the heart grows thinner. The old question still hangs there, how to be certain, while the right answer lies where few dare to look. Presence, listening, and respected boundaries. You gently promise the listener. In the next part, you will go on, still with soft steps, to see where that question will turn the court toward public debates, or toward doors ever more tightly closed. You give a final reminder. Breathe slowly, loosen the hands, because sometimes with only a single correct breath, the shadow of eyes on the wall shortens a little. You stand in a windless evening, hearing the fan run steadily like the long sigh of a house accustomed to the dark. You narrate in the present, slow and gentle, so the listener's shoulders can lower by themselves. In the final years, you see the king drained like a candle that has burned too long, wax running into thin streaks, the flame low and trembling, each slight breeze making it waver again. The whole court learns to operate in that void. Ministers guess intentions more than they deliberate. Documents travel in circles through many hands before arriving, and decisions come late like a train missing its beat. You walk along the stone corridor, where the smell of candle wax blends with old paper. At each doorway, you see pairs of eyes meet and then turn away, as if any plain-spoken sentence could make too loud a sound. Instead of asking what should be done, people ask what should be avoided. The work schedule is wrapped in another layer of ceremony. Counsel is carved into sentences just polite enough not to touch fear. You speak softly to the listener. Inhale 4 counts, hold 7 counts, exhale 8 counts. Not to prolong the story, but so the heart can reach the truth in time. When the one at the center is exhausted, the whole machine runs on inertia. Then one night the king lies down. The palace does not echo with collapse. You hear only a very quiet sigh, as if someone has finally put down an old burden. The royal physicians complete the procedures, ink drying on the final lines, a small wooden box sealed, and the sensitive documents carefully marked to be stored, like a lesson not fit to be read aloud. You do not touch the details of the body. You set your eyes on what remains the bequest of a reign guided by shame and suspicion, where power was many times used like armor for private fear. You open the frame beyond the gate, watching the city breathe. Madrid that night is not noisy. The streets lie still like a body self, healing in a shallow sleep. But at the crossroads, the nation steps into a clear intersection. A little princess, a court that must establish a new order, and cracks within society that need mending. You read in the guard's eyes an unspoken question. Will the morning be different? You hear in the maid's whispers a very human wish. Will tenderness have a place among the seals? You return to the study, where a thick ledger lies open on its last page. The royal physician closes the book, snuffs a candle. In the brief instant of darkness just fallen, you hear your own heart beat slowly, as if soothed by a rare peace. The bequest left behind is not only files, decrees, or notes on ceremony. The bequest is also an invisible model. How shame becomes a standard, how suspicion hardens into regulation, how a doubtful glance can drag along a whole chain of control. You lay your hand on the wooden table, see scratches like the map lines of a weary time. You go on, in a voice as light as setting a teacup on a tray. The court needs to establish a new order not by adding locks, but by adding language for trust. Society needs to mend the cracks not with a coat of paint, but by slowly fitting back the shards of confidence. A little princess needs to grow up in a house with open windows, where presence is valued no less than command, where the question, "Are you okay?" is placed before the question, "What now?" You know these things sound soft. Yet this very softness is what resists the brittleness of a system that has been rigid too long. You invite the listener to place a hand on the chest, to feel the heartbeat like a private clock. You say, the final lesson is whispered, not shouted. When private fear is not healed, it projects itself into the structure of power, and when power serves fear, the whole kingdom grows weary with it. This is true not only in a palace, it is true in every house, every organization, every small community where people forget to ask after each other's wounds. You pause a beat so the listener's room can breathe as well. You shift the frame to the very thin dawn of the next day. Windows crack open. Light pours in like ribbons of gold. In the inner courtyard, you see a floor cleaner pause a few seconds to hear the early birds. In the corridor, a young courtier puts away surplus dispatches heavy with seals. Those small movements are signals. It is possible to begin again by speaking plainly yet kindly, by naming fear and then bidding it farewell, by building institutions on clear boundaries and compassion thick enough. You promise no miracle. You simply pour more hot water into the teacup, the way people extend an important conversation. You end the telling with a long breath, not to draw the curtain, but to give the listener's heart a place to set down. In the darkness just settled, Madrid still breathes very evenly, as if lulling the times to sleep. But history is always awake, and will ask us again, in a voice light as wind, how can a dynasty learn to heal before it tires? You answer that question with presence. Inhale 4 counts, hold 7 counts, exhale 8 counts. Name the fear, And when possible, place your hand on someone's hand and say, "I am here." Because sometimes a sentence said in the right place can snuff out a flame of suspicion and light a candle steady enough for the whole room. You open the frame with a morning dull as frosted glass. Hear the ceiling fan running steadily like a long lullaby. You narrate in the present, slow and gentle, so the listener can place a hand on the chest, feeling the heartbeat lower with each gust of air. From a very private insecurity, you see the entire court gradually turning into a surveillance machine operating without a sound. The guard rotation schedule is printed on thick paper, quarter-folded and clipped with a brass pin. Secret passages are cleaned weekly, locks tested every noon. Orders to inspect correspondence are written in small letters, requiring a second seal along the edge of the envelope. The logbook of each meeting is kept in a locked drawer, every page with columns for time in, time out, brief contents, all knit together like a fine web, glittering under oil lamps. At the center of the net is a king perpetually hungry for proof that everything is safe. You watch how he gathers notebooks, stacks files, asks the same detail 3 times of 3 different people. Yet the more proof he gathers, the longer the shadow of suspicion grows. Like when you bring the lamp closer and the shape on the wall grows larger. He has more secret peepholes installed, adds guard posts, rotates food tasters by shifts, and each change is noted as temporary. Though temporary here is like weather that lasts an entire season, the queen learns to live in a glass cage. You see her walk slowly, breathe lightly, keep her gaze just enough. A greeting is measured by half a heartbeat, a smile held at the corner of the lips, so it is not misunderstood. Even prayer is calibrated, which words to say softly, where to stop, how long to let the pause last to avoid unwanted attention. She carries a slim notebook, recording each small thing. Walk 5 laps of the inner courtyard, recite prayers 10 minutes, keep silent 5 minutes before the hour chimes. In the glass cage, every movement has boundaries. The attendants both care and must report, as if walking on thin ice. You hear their shoes glancing over the tiles, the spoon touching porcelain softly, pages turning like butterflies' wings. They learn to record without revealing opinions, to listen without showing a glance, to answer without showing emotion. Weariness seeps into corridors, spreads through the warm scent of candle wax and freshly ironed fabric, and then crystallizes into a heavy silence. That silence teaches everyone to speak less, nod more, and fold their thoughts like folding a pocket handkerchief. You guide the listener to inhale 4 counts, hold 7 counts, exhale 8 counts. In that breath, you take them along stone walls where small vents are covered with patterns. You point to the guard change calendar with dots small as stars, each dot a new shift. You point to the clock bell that rings every half hour, as if reminding everyone that time too lies within the files. Every doorway has a regulation angle of opening, every curtain a proper drop, and every corridor a priority order when hearing footsteps approach. Outside the palace, the story of a court that whispers more than it speaks truth slowly leaks through diplomatic missions. You smell cold mist in the dispatches sent abroad. Mild instability, needs time, under review. A fragile agreement is postponed. A grant demands a new signature. A negotiating team asks for more days to wait. The Treasury must carry the invisible costs of the control machine. More guards, more seals, more surprise inspections. Each gold coin buys a little peace of mind, but that peace is like dry sand, gathered only to crumble grain by grain. Inside, everyone still tries to keep a normal rhythm of life. You see a simple breakfast, white bread, salted butter, mild tea. A Thanksgiving service with a small choir, voices just loud enough not to carry too far. An afternoon where sunlight pours onto brick, elm shadows spreading like a hand. Only that normal is built on countless conditions. How many degrees the door must be ajar, so no glint reflects onto the wall. How far the curtain must drop, so no suspicious shadow forms. Who is allowed to pass when the clock strikes, so paths do not cross. You understand that when normal requires many conditions, normal has become ritual. You stop in the inner courtyard, hear water in the stone basin fall into droplets. A clerk passes by, arms full of thick papers, eyes lowered to avoid accidentally catching a gaze. A guard changes shift, the heel striking the floor like tapping the palace's breath. You narrate in a soft voice. Here, people fear mishaps more than they hope for good. And when fear leads the way, every map adds new borders. You open an imaginary door. In a small room beside the window frame, there is a wooden chair without armrests. The queen sits there each afternoon, quietly counting her breaths. She places a hand on the window frame, feels the coolness of the wood, listens to elm leaves brushing each other like a whisper. Some days, she only watches the sun streaks crawl slowly across the floor. Some days, she reads a short passage and then folds it shut, letting the words rest inside like seeds not yet in season. Those small moments do not break the glass cage, but open a slit for the day to feel less heavy. You bring the listener back to the corridor, where the smell of candle wax and linen still lingers. You say softly, if you are listening in a dark room, try opening the window a crack. Then you invite them to breathe another 4, 7, 8 round, like laying a warm cloth on the forehead. Because you know the surveillance machine can run smoothly, but a human heart needs a different murmur, honest words, a small laugh, the question, are you okay? This section closes with a mist-light image. The queen places her hand on the window frame, looks at the shadows of elm trees in the courtyard. She exhales very slowly, a long breath, as if sending an invisible prayer for the palace to tremble less, for the heart of the one who reigns to quiet some of its self-made storms. You keep silence for a few seconds so that prayer can settle. Then you gently remind the listener, where there is a glass cage, there is still a slit of light. And in that slit of light, perhaps one day, the web will thin, so sunlight can touch more faces. You open the telling on a breezy evening, hearing the fan run steadily like the backing rhythm of a slow piece of music. You speak in the present tense, a voice soft as a lullaby, so the listener can let their shoulders loosen. As the surveillance machine swallows resources, you see the costs of ensuring safety quietly swell. More guards at every corner of the corridor. More informants recording meetings that seemed harmless. More tricky layers of inspection along the path of an ordinary letter. Each added layer is like another film of frosted glass. Seen through it, everything appears to require precautions, and therefore everything becomes expensive. The treasury is winded. You pass through the finance room, hear coins counted with a dry sound, hear the treasurer speak more softly than usual, as if afraid the numbers will leap off the ledger. The expense table now divides into new lines: night duty allowances, sealing tools, supplementary inspection costs, maintenance fees for hidden passageways. Each item is a stone tied to a boat rowing upstream. You blame no one. You only place a question as light as leaves touching. How many coins remain to trade for bread, to patch roads, to keep a bridge from rotting? Meanwhile, negotiations slacken. You see invitations rescheduled, see embassy delegations hesitate before the gate, hear requests for more time repeat like a refrain. Everyone waits for a more predictable political weather, an atmosphere that does not require passing through 100 cautious doors. Envoys send reports to their capitals, describing a royal court operating by arcs of ritual, where decisions travel the long way around, signatures arrive late, and answers are polite enough not to offend yet too light to change direction. In that slow interval, the country misses chances to mend economic cracks. You hear in distant provinces the complaint of wagon wheels over long broken roads. Hear district markets speak of harvests lacking capital. Hear the harbour tell of a ship turning back because papers arrived after the ebb. Far regions must fend for themselves, leaning on reserve granaries, relying on old crafts. A murmur of discontent rises like wind over dry fields, not roaring, but long, steady, smelling faintly of thirst. For the king, insomnia becomes a companion. You follow him through night after night, hear the clock step across stone walls, hear the pen touch paper in a room lit by a low oil lamp. The notebook is never full. Each page holds a few memo lines, small arrows linking one idea to another, a row of question marks. The physician recommends herbal tea, a few leaves with a clear fragrance. Advisors recommend simplifying ritual, fewer rounds of obeisance, fewer checkpoints. All of it is correct, yet none of it touches the root. That root is a nameless fear, the thing behind the surveillance machine, behind the habit of postponing decisions, behind the long, shallow nights of sleep. You invite the listener to inhale 4 counts, hold 7 counts, exhale 8 counts. In that quiet space, you tell how at times the king too wishes for a completely peaceful day. The morning audience held on time, documents travelling the direct path, and dinner ending with a gentle piece of music. In that vision, you see the brick courtyard freshly washed, sunlight poured evenly, and the final seal set down not by a trembling hand. But peace, when forced to prove itself by countless procedures, will leave of its own accord. It leaves like a courteous guest, looking around the house, seeing chairs already lined up for an inspection, then smiling farewell and closing the door very softly. You return to the daily rhythm of the palace. Ministers still come and go, but footsteps grow lighter. Clerks still copy and seal, but their eyes look lower. The council's breakfast is simple: white bread, cheese, warm water. Conversation at the meal does not go beyond the safe perimeter: weather, crops, the calendar of ceremony. News from outside has its sharp edges removed. Glad tidings are postponed, sad tidings kept quiet. You see more vases of white chrysanthemums in the room, a flower that blooms long and smells little, as if everything should be smooth, slow, reluctant to draw attention to its own worries. You pass through the chancery. On the long table are thick envelopes, wax seals stamped with unfamiliar signs. Their reports use familiar phrases: stable for now, under review, will reply. Yet between the lines you read confusion. How to negotiate with a court that hears more footsteps than arguments. An aid package is delayed 1 week. A treaty stops at the clause reconsideration. A trade commitment requires final verification. In the language of diplomacy, final is rarely final. Night comes, and you pass by the king's door and hear the slow turning of pages. He writes a few more lines, then sets down the pen again, as if every answer must pass through a corridor not yet found. You do not look at his face, you look at his hand, the hand accustomed to red seals now gripping the edge of the table. You think to yourself, sometimes the leader needs only a deep enough sleep to know, in the morning, to remove a few locks. For a moment, you let the oil lamp soften. Then you lead the listener into a small room beside the study, where a young official is spreading out a map. He points with a slim wooden ruler. The shortest route to resolve a long-standing issue, a canal branch to be dredged, a tax station to be merged, a negotiating line to go straight. His reasoning is neat as pencil lines drawn clear. The milestones are marked with easy-to-remember signs. You see in his eyes the light of someone well prepared. Do it now, and it will be in time. But then he gently folds the map. He knows that to reach the approval, the path still needs many more checkpoints. A cross-review, a double signature, a recap meeting. He slides the map into a leather tube, ties the cord lightly, and sits to wait. In that waiting posture, you see a whole country waiting. Waiting for a decisive tempo, waiting for a simplifying hand, waiting for a decision not dragged back by fear. You close the telling with a soft reminder. If you are listening on a sleepless night, try placing a hand on your chest, breathe slowly, and name your worry. Because, you say, a dynasty is like a person. When it dares to name its fear, the steps wind less. And perhaps, on the very next morning, the clock's sound will resemble music more than a reminder, and a seal set down will open, rather than lock, the shortest path the young man just indicated. You open the telling in an afternoon when the sunlight has softened, hearing the fan run steadily like a fine thread, stitching the air back together. You speak in the present tense, slow, gentle, so the listener feels their shoulders drop by themselves. Even kinship cannot escape the pressure of suspicion. You stand by the frame of the door, watching a family birthday begin with smiles more polite than natural. Blessings are weighed like official documents. Which sentence first, which sentence after, how long a pause is just right. Gifts are wrapped beautifully and correct down to each detail. Ribbon color appropriate, materials avoiding misunderstanding, the card written in slanted letters not too intimate and not too distant. You hear the sound of a fork touching porcelain like a probing tap, and in each smile there is a very fine frayed edge. The younger brother, who once was a support, is also examined through the lens of precaution. You see an unintentional frown, perhaps because of the light, perhaps because the cake is too sweet, suddenly turn into a line of notes in someone's memory. A trailing sentence, an arrival a few minutes late, a chair pulled with a small squeak. All can become evidence in some file somewhere, someday. You do not say who is right or wrong. You only record the feeling that the family is speaking in the language of caution more than the language of intimacy. In the midst of adults measuring and weighing is a child. She grows up among splendid rituals and unwritten rules, learns to bow at the correct angle, smile at the right moment, and place a hand on the chest when hearing the national anthem like a dance long practiced. She is loved as a symbol of the future, a promise for the dynasty. But around her is also a very human worry. Will tomorrow be all right? You see the nurses whispering about which porridge brings good sleep. See the tutor lower his voice when teaching history, as if history too needs to tread lightly. The joy of childhood here is like a bird perched on the hand. Beautiful, near, but one loud sound is enough to make it fly. The king looks at his child through small portraits painted in succession over the years. You see on his desk a row of miniatures. Hair a little longer, eyes a degree brighter, the corner of the mouth a fraction fuller. He tries to find points like himself, the shape of the eyebrows, the bridge of the nose, the line of the forehead, as a way to cling to certainty in a world always slipping away. Each time he finds a note of resemblance, he exhales very softly, like someone who has just set a hand on a familiar step. Scholars, physicians and clerics take turns giving moderate, safe assessments. You hear them use smooth words, encouraging, needs monitoring, in keeping with precedent, harmonious with tradition. Each assessment is a cushioning pillow, soft, enough for anyone reading to nod. But you know that amid those rounded sentences is an undertow of a question no one dares to say outright. What will keep the boat from capsizing when it meets wind? The king's bedchamber turns into a silent museum. You pass by and see on the wall the portraits of queens who have passed. Under the glass cabinet, a few mementos of unfinished happiness. A hairpin not yet used for the festival, a strip of wedding lace cut to serve as a bookmark, a short letter stopping at the sentence, "Tonight I." On the prayer table, pages of the holy book are marked with silver ribbons, the edges slightly worn from frequent touch. Visitors to court whisper that the place smells more of memory than of power. The scent of dried flowers, candle wax, old wood that has heard many sighs. You invite the listener to inhale 4 counts, hold 7 counts, exhale 8 counts. In that quiet, you pose the question history often asks very softly. What will keep a dynasty standing? A capitalized name on a family tree, a legal document stamped with seals, or the trust the people grant it? You think of a bridge. The name may be beautiful, the permits may be complete, but if the piers do not root deep into the soil of trust, a single wind is enough to make travelers hesitate. Kin grow distant not only because of ceremony, but also because of an invisible fear like mist. You see family meals striving to normalize, the familiar soup, a plate of crisp fried fish, a story about a cat in the garden. But mid-story, someone suddenly falls silent when the clock chimes. Someone straightens a fold of clothing, as if to remind themselves they are inside a stage frame. Intimacy requires freedom, and freedom requires trust. When trust is thin, each intimate gesture becomes a risk. You return to the child. She stands before an easel, brush in hand, trying to paint the color of a sky, both sunset and dawn, gentle blue with a thread of gold at the edge. You see in that painting a simple wish, to grow up in a house with open windows, where the question, "How do you feel?" is asked before, "Did you do it right?" You set lightly an imaginary cup of tea on the table, letting the scent of herbs carry the story toward kinder things. Night falls. The oil lamp in the king's room softens. He sits alone, holding a small miniature with a pale blue background. In that moment, his gaze softens as if seeing there not only the child's features, but an opportunity for everything to begin again in a gentler way. Fewer locked doors, more windows, fewer rituals, more presence, fewer tests, more questions of, "Are you all right?" You stand nearby like a storyteller's shadow and say softly to the listener, "Sometimes, to keep the future, We need to change how we keep from gripping to holding hands. This section closes with a very small image. The king sets the miniature back on its stand, his hand releasing slowly, as if afraid to scratch the layer of paint. Outside, the wind passes through the rows of elm trees into a low piece of music. You ask the listener to breathe one more 4-7-8 round, so the heart can find its ordinary rhythm again. Then you keep silent for a moment, letting the question about the future rest on the edge of the table. What will keep the dynasty standing? When the room is quiet enough, that very question will point the way not toward more locks, but toward more trust. You open the telling in a late afternoon, gilded on a slant, the fan running steadily like a fine thread stitching invisible gaps. You speak in the present tense, slow and gentle, so the listener feels their shoulders lower by themselves. There are years when suspicion reaches its tautest point. You see inspection procedures cross the private line. A form gets an added column for emotional notes. A private meeting requires a third person present. To verify, a family letter must pass through 2 seals and a short report. Dialogue becomes a loop, confirming what is already known, confirming that no one dares speak against the will. Each yes is placed exactly where it should be, like a brick, building a thin wall between person and person. Outside that wall, neighboring countries observe. You hear missions whisper about the possibility of a succession incident, hear them pose roundabout questions sharp as needles. Does the court have a continuity plan? Will the next season differ from this one? In diplomatic studies, maps are opened and folded, a wooden ruler tapping lightly on paper as if measuring the weather. Inside the palace, the physician adds a simple line of recommendations. Less tension, fewer sleepless nights, weaker coffee, a few steady breathing practices. All of it is correct, but you know the root lies elsewhere in the thought that just a little more control will make everything all right. Then the body speaks. You see a hand tremble when signing a dispatch that seems simple, a stomach weaken at breakfast time, a memory tire when a courtier's name suddenly slips at the tip of the tongue. There is no dramatic incident, only days ebbing away like a receding tide. Each morning, light still pours onto the brick courtyard, but the sun thins, and the sound of heels grows lighter, as if afraid to shatter a thin layer of calm. You lead the listener along the corridor, where curtains are dropped exactly to a safe length. Here, the question, is everything all right, is gradually replaced by, is it under control? Servants learn to step very softly. Officials learn to speak just enough. Physicians learn to prescribe with conditional if, then sentences. You invite the listener to inhale 4 counts, hold 7 counts, exhale 8 counts like laying a warm cloth on the forehead. In that breath, you see the picture more clearly. When suspicion is prolonged, trust thins like wet paper. Autumn arrives without noise. Dry leaves on the brick courtyard sound clearer than orders. You stand at a half-open window, watch elm leaves spin and settle like letters never sent. Wind slips through the curtain, bringing the scent of candle wax and old wood into the room, making file pages quiver slightly. In that same tremor, you see a dynasty's weariness. Decisions arriving 1 beat late, meetings ending 1 sentence early, hands resting on the seal a moment longer out of hesitation. When the king closes his eyes, the court does not erupt. You hear only a curtain of silence fall, thick but not heavy, like someone finally setting a burden down on the veranda. Rites are carried out thoroughly, bell called, candles lit, robes adjusted, lines on documents moving along the proper rows. Private papers are sealed, not to hide the truth from the public, but to remind future rulers that some stories should be read with compassion rather than under a searchlight. You see the red wax seal dry along a file's edge, and in that drop of red is the shape of a counsel. Read slowly and listen before deciding. The final medical record is gently tied. It tells of a body that tried to adapt to pressures beyond endurance. A heartbeat sometimes fast, sometimes slow, sleep in fragments, dull aches when the weather shifts. It tells of a mind that wore itself down to hold what cannot be held. Prevention lists growing longer, memories stacked like books, conversations only to confirm that silence is still safer than speech. You lay a hand on the imagined cover, feel a warmth rising from the paper, the warmth of a writer spent, yet still writing. You pull the frame back to the brick courtyard. Dry leaves keep rolling, gathering into brown borders along the foot of the wall. A guard changes shift, his heels striking the ground, like tapping the city's breath. Overhead, the autumn sky is blue and low, as if a cold cloth were already hung to lay upon the brow of a long fever. You hear passers-by grow quieter, hear pigeons on the stone ledge speak to each other in a language that needs no censorship. In that moment, you invite the listener to breathe one more 4, 7, 8 round. You say softly, "If there is something to be sealed, seal it along with a note about compassion." Because you know, power is only a form of energy. It will be warm if wrapped in trust, and cold if wrapped only in suspicion. Autumn, in its own way, teaches the lesson of letting go. Leaves do not leave branches because they are weak, but because it is time for the earth to need a blanket. At last, the chapel bell rings briefly, not heroic, not tragic, merely a farewell to a weary journey. You stand still for the sound to settle, like a small wave lapping ashore and dissolving. In that layer of quiet, you hear a question return, light as wind slipping through the window frame. How can tomorrow be more peaceful than today? You do not answer with a speech. You place a breath into the listener's hand. Inhale 4 counts, hold 7 counts. Exhale 8 counts so the answer can appear by itself, like a leaf falling into its rightful place, needing no one to point the way. You open the final part on a serene evening, hearing the fan turn steadily like the slow pulse of a city at rest. You narrate in the present tense, a voice light as a lullaby, so the listener can relax their shoulders, set down any remaining burdens. After the curtain falls, a new era begins with a very young successor and a court that must swiftly reset its rhythm. You see succession documents spread across the table, underlying disputes hinted at in small print, and ripples of power stirring through closed meetings. All await a calm hand to restore order. But you whisper that the greatest lesson is not on paper but in collective memory. When private fear governs public institutions, society will grow weary. When shame is sealed rather than healed, suspicion seeps into the machinery's bloodstream. You invite the listener to inhale 4 counts, hold 7 counts, exhale 8 counts. In that moment, you remind them that the most memorable legacy is not only past mistakes, but a gentle reminder to anyone in power: learn the art of healing. Know how to seek counsel from the right people, trust in science, respect mental boundaries, and put people before ceremony. You continue. As for the populace, there is also another whispered message: demand transparency enough that power cannot serve fear alone. They have the right to see the records, ask difficult questions, and prevent leaders from hiding behind a rosy veneer of ritual. The story closes like a lullaby. Madrid at night still breathes evenly. Window panes darken one by one. Prayers fall softly upon the rooftops. You believe that if you are listening to find sleep, take a long, slow breath. Inhale 4 counts, hold 7 counts, exhale 8 counts. Let the past remain in the past. Allow yesterday to sleep undisturbed. You conclude with a final note. Tomorrow, history will open a new page, a page delicate, yet wide enough for compassion and clarity to continue writing together. May you sleep peacefully in the city's ancient lullaby, where any night can begin again with hope.